It's lovely to have you here on this beautiful sunny day. I'm Sarah Stein, and I am the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Center for Jewish Studies and a Professor of History in the Viterbi Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies here. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all. I think moving inward is a great idea. People would like to move inward. Delighted to welcome all of you to today's program. There's coffee and some treats outside. I think they prefer that we not bring it in the room, but help yourself. So I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Sarah Imhoff from Indiana University for today's program, Another Zionism, Jessie Sampter, Queerness and Disability. But before I let her take the podium, just a few words of welcome and thanks. So we are delighted that this event is co-sponsored by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, Disability Studies at UCLA, and LGTBQ Studies, and we thank them for their partnership. And thank you for being here, and those watching at home for staying with us in this socially distant and intellectually engaged time. So I'd like to read to you a bit about the book and project that you will now be hearing about. Jessie Sampter, as you will hear from the author herself, embraced Zionism as an adult, moved to Palestine in 1919, yet her own life and body did not match Zionist ideals. While Zionism celebrated the strong and healthy body, Sampter spoke of herself as quote-unquote crippled from childhood polio and plagued by weakness and sickness her whole life. While Zionism applauded reproductive women's bodies, Sampter never married or bore children. In fact, she wrote of homoerotic longings and had a same-sex relationship we might consider queer. Though she committed herself to Zionism, she also offered ideological alternatives to its most popular visions. Those words are not mine. They are those of Professor Sarah Imhoff, the J. and Jeannie Schottenstein Chair in Jewish Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the Boren's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University. Professor Imhoff writes about religion and the body with a particular interest in gender, sexuality, disability, and American religion, and also plants sometimes, as well as maintaining a research specialty in religion and law. She is the author of Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism from Indiana Press in 2017, and The Lives of Jessie Sampter, Queer Disabled Zionist, Duke University Press, 2022. If that were not energy enough, she is founding co-editor of the journal American Religion and is now working on a co-authored book with Susanna Heschel about women and gender in Jewish studies, due to be published this year by Princeton Press. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, and we thank you for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much, Professor Stein. That was a lovely introduction. Today I'm going to talk a little about Jessie Sampter. I've been living with her since 2011, off and on. I think about her when I'm gardening. I think about her sometimes when I'm walking, sometimes when I'm eating. She doesn't know me because she died well before I was born, but I am fascinated by her. There are a bunch of things, however, that she's not. She never became a major Zionist communal leader, nor did her writings enter the canon of Zionist, much less Jewish philosophy. Her writing about Zionism and Judaism is consistently smart, but garnered few followers. I find her poetry interesting because of its political aims, but frankly, it's kind of formulaic and sometimes it's mediocre. Her correspondents and friends included people well known to history. Mary Antin became famous for her immigrant memoir, The Promised Land. Henrietta Sold ran Hadassah with seemingly infinite energy. Mordecai Kaplan founded the Reconstructionist movement in Judaism. Louis Brandeis was the first Jew appointed to the US Supreme Court. And Albert Einstein, well, we all know his name. So though she had quite a few famous friends, Sampter herself never became a celebrity. She was neither extraordinarily powerful in her time, nor really super influential after it. And so when I wrote about Sampter, it wasn't my intention to praise a lost poetic genius, to show that she profoundly influenced American Judaism, or to hold her up as a saint. Yet, writing her life with unflinching attention to embodiment did offer me a model of how we might understand religious thought and thinkers, not just as fine intellects, but as people with inextricably linked bodies and minds. Jessie Sampter was born in 1883 to a wealthy Jewish family in New York. Here's the only remaining photo I've seen of her father, Rudolf Sampter. When she was 12, she had polio. She survived the initial infection, but its effects stayed with her throughout her life. Today, doctors call what Jessie experienced post-polio syndrome. That meant that even on her best days, the curvature of her spine meant that walking long distances would never be possible for Sampter. And the muscle damage and thumb deformity precluded most kinds of physical labor. Yet, as a young adult, she embraced Zionism, a movement that celebrated strong bodies and cultivating the land. She experienced a wide variety of religious ideas and ideals, even from her youth. Here's a picture of her from her youth. I think it's interesting, in many of her photos, she has her hands somewhere the camera can't see. Occasionally you can see her hands, but this one, I think, especially because it's from when she's young, she would be hiding her hands because she was embarrassed about the way they looked. Her family was part of the ethical culture movement and had a Christmas tree when she was growing up. But Sampter turned back to Judaism. Some of her early works follow transcendentalist veins. She loved Emerson. She admired Jiddu Krishnamurti's work and later in life translated some of it into Hebrew. And yet, she didn't think of her own worldview as incoherent or contradictory. These different religious traditions, she thought, helped her understand the world better. Her life not only defied religious boundaries, it also defied norms of family and reproduction. So shortly after she moved to Palestine in 1919, she met Leve Berlin, and the two lived together on and off for the rest of her life. They made financial and personal decisions together. Berlin cared for Sampter on the days when she was too weak or ill to care for herself. Sampter adopted Tamar, a Yemenite toddler, and Leve Berlin often cared for her too. This is a photo of Sampter, well, both Sampters, Jessie Sampter and Tamar Sampter. They moved to kibbutz Givat Brenner together in the early 1930s, and when the kibbutz members had to decide whether to let them join, they knew that Berlin and Sampter would only come together. Friends thought of them as a well-suited couple, Berlin big and capable, and Sampter passionate and fragile. They were kin. I don't know if they had sex. To me, this is actually far less interesting than knowing how they made their lives together. Sampter's writing, as well as her relationships, was characterized by queer desire. And by queer desire, I mean both that she sometimes expressed sexual desire for women and that she occasionally expressed a desire to be a boy or a man. It's for these reasons, rather than reasons about kind of knowing about explicit sexuality, that I think of her life as a queer life. I talk a little bit less about this today, but I'm also happy to say more in Q&A. In many ways, both Sampter's life and her thought represent what seem like a series of paradoxes, and this is part of why she was so compelling to me. How could she simultaneously advocate for nationalism, Zionism, and internationalism? How could she fit herself in a Zionist society that valued Jewish women's reproduction? How could she make sense of the gendered ideals of her political movement and the reality of inequality? And how could she be disabled and support a Zionism that so explicitly celebrated strong bodies and denigrated weak ones? Today, I'll show how Sampter sometimes doubted the value of her own disabled body and sometimes bought into the Zionist rhetoric that claimed that Jews should be strong if they were to belong to the new Jewish society. Yet the overarching message, and I think the most interesting historical one here, is that Sampter supported Zionism while offering a deep critique of its celebration of strong and able Jewish bodies while excluding others. Just for interest, I think I have these out of order, but this is the book that Albert Einstein wrote the preface to. So when I said they weren't like, super close friends, but this is part of some of her early work about Palestine. And then here she is with Leve Berlin at kibbutz Givat Brenner in the 1930s. In 1919, after several years of publishing Zionist essays and poems, designing Zionist educational materials, and serving on Hadassah's Central Committee, Sampter decided to move to Palestine. She wrote that she bought a trousseau and declared herself married to Palestine. And in fact, on her application for a passport, there's a part that asks whether you'll be traveling with your wife, and she would cross that out vigorously. She was really excited about making this trip, but she also quickly recognized that in some ways, Palestine would be more disabling than her life in New York had been. Not only did Palestine have less developed infrastructure than the US did, but the Zionist culture there promoted physical health as noble and ennobling. This is the image, for example, that accompanied one of Sampter's many articles, right? You can see here is a physically able man with his muscles showing who is working the land. I think there's an irony that this is what's next to Sampter's article, and we'd see similar things with many of the articles published in the Zionist press. Even Hadassah, the US Women's Zionist organization, saw the task of Jewish state building and citizenship as a manly one, and as things for the able-bodied. The Hadassah leader and close friend of Sampter, Henrietta Sold, wrote in 1921, "Our nerves need steadying, our muscles are flabby, our resistance is weak, our morale and discipline infirm. Everything must be brought in until men of muscle, judgment, experience, expertise, and means come in and develop its resources. Men of muscle have begun to come, the young, energetic Halutzim of whom you have heard. They are the brawn of Jewish community." When I read this, I think with this kind of rhetoric, what space was there for people with disabilities in this new Jewish society? Or women, frankly. Which is interesting, coming from the Hadassah leader, who's in fact instrumental to creating especially health infrastructure in the new society. Sampter spent several weeks in Hadassah's hospital in Jerusalem soon after she arrived in Palestine. When she recovered enough to write about it, she did not apologize for her inability to work, nor did she see herself as a drain on the Zionist cause. Rather, her essays framed her experience as a celebration of Zionism for her English-speaking audiences. She praised the hospital itself. "To me, it was almost worth the discomfort of a serious illness that I might spend several weeks as a patient, in the ranks of patients, in our own Hadassah hospital in Jerusalem, the Rothschild Hospital." She celebrated its democratic structure. "I had no special privileges save the privilege of a pleasant personal acquaintance with many of the physicians and nurses. I lay in the general women's ward. In the Rothschild Hospital, there are no private rooms, and consequently there's no private versus ward psychology on the part of the nurses. They are in fact sisters. They are called in Hebrew achiot, sisters to all their patients, with a friendliness, a kindliness, a comradely helpfulness that seems equal toward the Yemenite housewife, the poor Ashkenazi widow, the Hebrew school teacher, or the physician's wife." Her American Zionist audience, for whom this was written, could see the Zionism they hoped for: collectivist, democratic, philanthropic, scientific. Her readers in Hadassah included the big yearly convention, loved it. A.H. Bixman, who was president of the Pittsburgh chapter, wrote it up for the Jewish Criterion, and she closed her own essay with Sampter's words, "As for myself, I hope I may be pardoned for repeating again the words of Jessie Sampter, who concluded her beautiful article entitled Bed Number 6, published in the last issue of the B'nai Israel Bulletin, with the phrase, 'God bless Hadassah, and forgive me if I am proud of her.'" Copies of Bed Number 6, this essay, were subsequently sent to all chapters. And yet, even while Bed Number 6 strongly supported Zionist ideas, you can see this sort of cuteness in my reading of it, it's clearly an idyllic version, it also cripped Zionism. And here I'm referring to the mode of disability critique named for the reclamation of the word crip, which is a shortening of crippled. So it's kind of a rereading or a changing or an internal critique with disability in mind. The essay's narrator and many other characters were physically or mentally disabled, and yet they played important roles in the new society. It even shows pioneers as potentially ill and disabled. 2 or 3 young pioneers, Halutzim, look down ill from the working men's camp. They are contented and quiet. So in Sampter's account, all bodies, even those of the Hale pioneers, were susceptible to illness and disability. And that was nothing to be ashamed of. Unlike the Zionist narratives that celebrated the overcoming of malaria as a rite of passage, yes, there are lots of those, here the emphasis was not on overcoming, and it was not on toughing it out. Sampter herself, physically in pain and struggling with depression, told the story of her time in the hospital as illustrating not only Hadassah's Zionist ideals of state building and providing medical care, but also her own Zionist ideals of an inclusive Jewish culture that embraced Yemenite Jews, disabled women, and sick Halutzim, not as outsiders, but as central figures. So even from her early days writing in Palestine, then, Sampter was cripping Zionism to make space for disabled bodies. This commitment, incidentally, echoed beyond her writing. Sampter hoped for the creation of the first deaf school in Palestine. She raised money from both the US and Palestine and worked on the committee that would ultimately create the school. For her, the project was part philanthropy, but also part political work. She wanted to shape a Zionism that included these students. Although she followed along with the dominant mode of teaching deaf students, which at the time was oralism, which encouraged them to speak instead of signing, she still insisted that these students could and should be full members of the new Zionist society. So part of her condition to moving to Givat Brenner, because she had some money, so she and Leve, when they moved to Givat Brenner, said, one of the things that we want there is a vegetarian rest home. And the idea behind the vegetarian rest home, which was built, this is it, was for workers or others who were exhausted or perhaps couldn't work, a place for them to come and recuperate, to feel safe and not feel pushed into going back to work before they were able. So this is another example. There's the deaf school, but we also see this as another example of not only her thinking, but also her desire to enact her Zionism. This is not to say, however, that making space for disabled bodies was easy, and Sampter sometimes despaired. In May 1921, she wrote, "I dreamt the other night that I offered my life for the life of a Halutz. Then I found myself turning into the Halutz. I did not want that. I wanted to give him my life. I said so, and it happened. I died, and he lived." A simple enough dream of desire. Her dream suggests a society that values the life of a pioneer over the life of a disabled woman. We can also read this additional ways, like her being reborn as a man, or her sometimes wanting to identify as a man, but then not ultimately. And in the end, though she calls it simple enough, I think it's not simple at all. Sampter struggled with this popular Zionism that valued a strong and healthy Jewish body above all. Several years later, she wrote of a similar sort of despondency in response to this feeling that there was no space for her. "It seemed to me there was nothing for me to do here because I had not the working body. I thought I had lost all influence and power, and I was wasted." Our gift of language must in large measure be wasted here. It may seem as if the best and deepest of us are wasted, but I think that is not true. There is a better and a deeper. It is our vanity that is shattered, not our worth that is lost. We shall unify at last the body and spirit, sanctify the work of our hands with the consecration of it to heart and head. So this harkens to some of her religious philosophy that I won't spend a lot of time getting into. But here I'll just say that it reiterates her metaphysical understanding of the unity of things we would call body and mind and spirit. But interestingly, we also see the way that it despairs that Zionism in Palestine is actually only valuing one of those. It's only valuing physical prowess and wasting minds and spirits, or at least it seems like that sometimes. Creating space for a disabled body and appreciating the political value of minds and spirits were more than philosophical issues for her. Without them, she questioned the value of her own life. This paragraph was much more despondent and despairful as to my own powers, she admitted, that paragraph you just heard. But Leah and another friend had listened to her read the paragraph and support her. This conversation supported her, in which they insisted on my worth as a friend, proved a turning point in my decision, for I was, at this time, resolved to kill myself as soon as I had finished the book, and here she's referring to an unpublished autobiography. Yet Leah and her friends made Sampter feel valued, and through their eyes, she could see her own value to a crip Zionist project. As she toured different parts of Palestine, which she did when she was recovered, she met pioneers and workers. And even as a tourist, she saw the gaps between Zionist ideals and what was happening for Jews in the Yishuv. The Jewish colonies in the Galilee were inspiring and depressing, she wrote to her brother-in-law, Edgar Wachenheim. She wrote that Jewish villages all have something in common. They have a fine, daring spirit, pioneer courage. And yet, they also at once glorified physical health and took it for granted. They do not fear work, but with few exceptions, they do not understand its dignity. A tendency to be arrogant, super intellectual, and to look upon themselves as heroes. Her unpublished novel, In the Beginning, had Jewish boys, bronze-legged, working in the fields, but in the same breath criticized the narrowness of these same Zionists. So we can see the push and the pull here. She wanted a broader Zionism, one that recognized the unity of body, soul, and spirit, and also recognized the diversity of bodies. To Mordecai Kaplan, she wrote, "The problem of the Jewish soul can only be solved here." She means the Yishuv. "And through firsthand knowledge of life here. Yet no one will solve that problem, even here, unless he comes truly in the spirit of the Chalutz, prepared to make material sacrifices and to take his chance in the labor market here, whether in the highest or lowest field." For an engineer or painter, she meant that would mean willingness to work in the field. For Sampter, that meant the material sacrifices, from the American toilet paper that she really liked, her preferred woolen stockings, to the nearness of family and the less disabling infrastructures of American urban environments. Spiritual regeneration and a sound economic basis, which is part of this letter, were not two unconnected goals, she writes. "I believe the two must come together, that they are aspects of one vision." So again, this is the material alongside the ideal. Although Kaplan's Zionism was not always orthodox, it did center on the image of the virile, self-perpetuating Jew, those are his words, in Palestine. Despite Kaplan's influence on her, which was quite significant, Sampter's never did. Even some of her essays that don't explicitly discuss disability show the tensions between a Zionist ideal of able-bodiedness and the reality of a population whose bodies varied. In 1923, for example, Sampter wrote an article about why some Jews were leaving Palestine. The answer seemed mundane. They didn't have jobs. But it was more complicated, she said. They also felt they had no place in society if they were part of the so-called non-productive element. Sampter thought this problem could be fixed, which seems like it would go along with her ideas. But then when she recommended the ways of increasing options for more productivity, like creating fisheries or expanding loans to include Palestine-born Jews, those options sounded like they were still feeding into the productivity narrative. Perhaps she felt that a plan that truly valued the so-called non-productive element was too radical to be accepted by other Zionists. Maybe her editor made changes, but I think it's more likely that she had also internalized some of Zionism's producer-minded ethos. The article shows how a non-normative embodied life, in this case, that of someone who was not materially or economically productive, mattered deeply for Zionist politics. Disability activists often explain that people with disabilities have experiences and subjectivities that are distinctive, not just because of what they lack or the obstacles they face in the world, but also because they represent distinctly valuable ways of seeing the world. I see so many of these in Jessie Sampter, beginning with her religious philosophies of body and mind that you heard a little bit about here. Among Sampter's unpublished papers, I came across a one-page reflection on disability, normalcy, and what counts as a real life. She would have written it shortly after this photo was taken. I read it, I paused, I read it again. It was really poignant and astute, and it was the words of an introspective woman looking back on life in her body. And then I realized that she had written it just a couple of months before she died. So I will read some of it to you. For 43 years, since I was 12 years old, I have been an invalid, or rather what is called a semi-invalid, half an invalid. For all that time, the valid part of me has been striving desperately to be normal, to think, to feel, to experience the ordinary human thing. The other half, the damaged half, has been striving desperately to suck out of its wounds all the salt and the sweetness of the extraordinary, the exotic. It has formed beautiful galls, as beautiful as leaves and flowers, and much more fantastic. I have stopped striving. I have stopped to look and examine and make my account with life. The pain has been very sweet. It may have been hard to bear. Death would have at any time been easier, but having been born, it is good to look back upon. The happiness, the ordinary human thing, has been cracked through and through by inadequacy. It was always only half. A child that was not born to me, love without domesticity, walks from which one had to drive home, and independence with strings to it. And yet, as I figure up the account, it all seems to have been valid. Every kind of life is, if one lives it. So, this candid reflection on walks cut short by pain and disability, on feelings of inadequacy, on the struggle to make sense of seemingly incongruent parts of a self, showed a woman who reflected deeply about how her own embodied experiences shaped her life. I read it to you at length because I think it shows in Sampter's own voice the richness of her own understanding of her life. It shows how she might have had moments of seeing disability as sin, as an obstacle, as an issue for Zionism, or even as a metaphor, but it was also a profound and valuable way of seeing the world. It was her profound and valuable way of seeing the world. Validity, which is what she titled this, prefigures many of the movements in current disability studies. Memoir and first-person reflections, for example, have become standard bearers in the field. And here, Sampter anticipates many of the philosophical and theoretical foci of that literature. Her essay speaks of pain and sadness. And yet, in the end, the speaker does not disavow these or reject a faulty body, but rather claims all parts of her life as a real life, a valid life. Thanks.
Are you okay?
I'm happy to field questions.
May I?
Yeah.
Well, I love your play with language in the book, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about one section in which you ruminate on how her legacy has not been honored. No street named after her, the writing not widely available, and you think about the embodied quality of this and how not only is there an unwillingness to think about crip Zionism, but scholars have only thought about the bodies of these thinkers when they are disabled rather than able-bodied. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the theory of crip Zionism does for the study of Zionism generally, and maybe the same question could be asked about queer Zionism, mm-hmm. and how it might be used to redefine more broadly the fields with which these areas are engaged. And then I have a more minor question, but you mentioned in the slide the resting home being vegetarian, but I don't remember this coming up in the book. So I was curious about what vegetarianism meant to her. Yeah. And in an embodied life, as you were arguing for it, was this as central to her very currents of thought as the other elements you described?
The vegetarian one is easier and faster. It was not as central as the other ideas, and she had doctors who would continually tell her because she was weak, she needed to eat meat, she needed to eat eggs, she needed to eat butter. So vegetarianism for her was an ideal, but one that she felt she shouldn't always pursue because doctors were telling her, here's what you need to eat. Like if you ate these eggs and butter, then you would be less weak. Right. So in retrospect, we might question those doctors. But the short answer is no, vegetarianism was not so central to her life. And the vegetarian rest home stopped being vegetarian as soon as she died, interestingly. A lot of the kibbutz members were kind of like, well, it's sort of a pain to do this. It's not always what the people who are visiting want. And then once she was gone, they were like, well, we'll keep it going in her honor. They rename it Beit Yesha. They call her Yesha. But the vegetarian part goes to the side. Yeah, so I think thinking about crip Zionism and queer Zionism does one kind of obvious thing, which is to remind us that history is not inevitable, right? That in the Yeshuv, before there's a state, there are multiple Zionisms that can coexist because there's not because there's not a state. In fact, not all of these people even want a state. So Sampter was, for example, a binationalist. That's not true of many of the other folks even that she associates with. So, I mean, in one sense, that's part of what it gets us, is it just reminds us that there are, in fact, multiple Zionisms. I think more deeply, it's a methodological push. Zionism, the study of Zionism has been one of those things where people are usually pretty good at remembering that there are bodies because it's really hard to read Zionist texts or look at Zionist images and not pay attention to bodies. But it's often true that the conversation begins and ends with the idea of diaspora Jews being weak and Zionist new Jew being strong, masculine, productive. But of course, that's not the actual experience of the vast majority of Zionists historically. Most of them are not weak diaspora Jews who move to Palestine and reinvent themselves as farmers, right? Like, that's actually a tiny minority. And I think this helps us remember that that the study of Zionism and bodies shouldn't just be an examination of that kind of ideology, right? That in fact there are other ideologies out there and there are other experiences out there. I mean, the vast majority of experiences are other than that, in addition to that there are multiple ideologies. I think that queer Zionism does something similar. I talked a little bit less about it today, but the project in the Yeshuv, the kibbutz movement, these are moments that people kind of self-consciously know that they can rethink families and gender roles. And in lots of ways, they come out the other side looking kind of heteronormative and pretty much what other folks were up to at the same time anyway. But that doesn't mean that that was what Sampter or her fellow kibbutzniks or lots of other people were hoping that would come from the kibbutz. I think there's some really exciting queer Zionist history happening now, and it's, I think, asking about sexuality and asking about non-normative gender roles is really interesting in these, especially like on the kibbutz, where everybody is just in everyone's business physically all the time. What does difference in gender, what does difference in sexuality look like there? Yeah, so there I think there's a lot of cool work being done, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of that as we get to read more of that too. Yeah.
Hi, I have two questions. So the first is, you mentioned that she discussed or recognized that she was not economically or materially productive, but did she identify herself as intellectually productive? And if so, did she see that as a privilege in her identity? And secondly, in looking at crip Zionism, so much of it is focused on the body, but what does that look like, I suppose, for neurodiversity and different iterations of disability?
Yeah. So the question about what does this look like as far as neurodiversity goes, Sampter is a little bit less involved in that work. Part of what I didn't mention is that she's particularly invested in education for Jews from Yemen who are being excluded from kindergartens and other places. And I think there's something really interesting to be done thinking about Jews, non-US or European Jews who are coming into Palestine and are imagined to have or constructed as having mental illness or things like that. And sometimes I think we can look at it and say like, that sure looks like cultural difference and not mental illness to us. And other times we can say like, oh, that person is a person who needs additional help or isn't going to participate in this kind of Zionist project the way that someone might like. So I think, I guess my short answer is, that's a great question, and I think there's really something there and more to be done on that. Sampter is probably not the best avenue in because that was not, it was not on her radar quite so much, but it's not never on her radar. She wrote another essay about being in the hospital, and there was a young Mizrahi, was she from Yemen or Morocco, I forget, woman there who had mental illness, and Sampter reflects on what does that mean and thinks about this person as someone who like is actually an important member of a Zionist society and just needs to be brought along to see that, and others around her need to be brought to see that. So I think we can sort of extrapolate what she might think, but I also think that that's a great question and we might look to other historical sources to think about that. Remind me of your first question.
Did she...
yes, did she see herself as privileged? In some ways, yes. She notices that she has privilege economically, and that's part of what allows her to write. But she does also get frustrated when she doesn't get paid to write things, because that is part of what sustains her. So sometimes she recognizes her privilege and sometimes she doesn't, but she does see her writing as a contribution to Zionism.
Hi, thank you for your fascinating talk. I really see the wide spectrum of Zionism in your work. I have two questions. First is, you mentioned that you started to work on this project since 2011. That's been like 11 years already. Yeah. I wonder what makes you interested in this project. Do you have like personal connection with her or her family? Second question is is related to the photos you showed. I wonder under what kind of circumstances did this photo were them like taken? Mm-hmm. Were they for publicity for Zionism, or did it take by the family? And is there any difference between different kinds of photos by different people?
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
that's a great question. So I found Jessie Sampter in the archives when I was working on my first book about masculinity, because I was writing a chapter in there about Zionism and wondered what some women Zionists had to say about masculinity, and it turned out she wasn't a great source for that, but her writing is really fascinating to me, and early on I was hooked. What does it mean that this woman who is really unlikely Zionist, she's from this ethical culture family with money, she has polio, she lives this totally non-normative life where she makes these, like lives most of her life with another woman. Why does she turn to Zionism, right? Like that was not the obvious path, it wasn't even an easy path. And yeah, so that kind of hooked me. And I hadn't had any connection with the family. Obviously I visited the kibbutz. This picture, for example, is from the kibbutz. They have a number of photographs there. So I don't know who took them, but it's clear that on some day, somebody took a series of photographs, not only of Sampter, but of other people too. And that happened a couple of times because there are photos from the kibbutz from a couple of different phases. She was just this really interesting intellectual puzzle to me. And then as I started to pull on that, I was like, oh, she's also really interesting methodologically. She's also really interested for reasons of thinking about American religion. And then what I thought was going to be like, an article became a whole book. I've only seen one photo of her that was specifically for publicity, and it's not in this slide. She's a bit older, and it's just a headshot. And that was taken, I don't know who took it, but it was taken for the Jewish Publication Society to go with one of her books. Some of these, this is from the kibbutz archives. I think that's from the early 1950s, actually. But this is also on the kibbutz. I have no idea who took this. But I do know that it's on the steps of she had a house built in Rehovot, and Leah did not live here with her for most of that time because part of Leah's family was also in Palestine and she was sort of going back and forth. But let's see. And this photo is a professionally taken photo that would have been paid for by her family where she was like, right, you can tell, like, this is not what she chooses to wear in the rest of her life. She's not wearing this in any of the other photos. I'm sure she's, like, sitting uncomfortably on some stool or something, right? So I don't know the history of all of these photographs, but we can see, I think it's a great question because we can see, like, oh, here we get some of the sense of the privilege that she comes from, but then later we get the sense that she's, like, out in nature in the garden where she loves gardening and flowers, but she is also seems a bit uncomfortable, right? And this is it's not a fully candid shot, right? She's looking at whoever's taking it, but I also don't think that somebody posed her because would they really put her behind a dahlia? Probably not. So yeah. So I wish I had more complete answers for many of these, but I think it's a great question to think about the different pieces of her life. Yeah.
You said earlier that she knew Albert Einstein. So did you find a letter from Einstein to her?
Yes. I don't. They weren't buddies, but he supported Zionism, and this book that she put together. So the symposium part is she's collecting other Zionist writers, and she wrote to him and said, would you write a preface to this? Here's the manuscript of it. He says yes, and he sends it back. Yes, yeah. So there are a couple letters in German between them.
Another question. This is a delicate one. But the history of adoption of Yemeni children is so painful and fraught at this time. Were you able to dig into the story there?
Yes. So this is a little bit before the what is clearly a really terrible policy of taking babies from mothers who are from Yemen and adopting them, and they're telling them that the baby has died or something, and then adopting them out to mainly Ashkenazi parents. Tamar was at an orphanage when Sampter met her, and Sampter visited her over a series of a few months, and when she writes to her sister, she's like, I've been visiting this child, she's really charming, maybe with an eye to adopting her. The story that's told by the orphanage is that during a snowstorm, she was left in a basket at the orphanage, and she was probably like under 2. She would have been quite small then. So I don't know, and that's the most I can get out of that. It seems like this orphanage was a functioning orphanage, so unlikely to be most of what we know about what happened later with the taking of children was more like medical establishment setup, and this seems like it's probably a different story. I don't know, right? So that's the story. I suspect that Sampter would have known more because she was fairly well connected within communities of Jews from Yemen, because she was already by this time interested in education and working with younger women who would teach in these kindergartens. So I suspect that, at least as far as Sampter knew, that is what had happened, that someone had left her someone had left Tamar at the orphanage. I don't know of any other stories of that orphanage adopting out kids from Yemen either. So, yeah. So I don't know fully, but I have some reasons to believe that it's not a replication of the story that we see later of the like quite intentional and really horrible taking of children and placing them with mothers who are deemed superior. I mean, also, Sampter is not a mother who would be deemed superior, right? Like, so she's, yeah.
Thank you.
Connected to that, I was wondering, does she write about the experience of, I'm assuming she identified as like a single mother, and the queerness of that nuclear family structure?
Interestingly, no. I think part of this is because many of the educational structures that she's part of in the issue are kind of run by women. Like, women are the main educators, and when she's thinking about raising Tamar, a lot of it is about education. Like, she obviously loves Tamar, and she thinks of education really broadly. Like, it's important for her to play, it's important for her to try cutting paper dolls, it's important for her to try music, right? But she thinks of her, and like today we would say like child development, right? And I wonder if part of the reason she's not so reflective on that is because all around her she sees women doing those jobs, even if there are men somewhere in the house. She doesn't even expect that they should do that job. Yeah, but that's a good question.
Great, well, thank you. If there's no further questions, we want to thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you all for being here today.